Today we're going to be taking a look at the secret origins of the Horus Heresy. So, what are the secret origins of the Horus Heresy? I hear you ask. What nonsense are you talking about? We all know what happened. We know about Erebus, we know about Corferon, and we know about Horus's fall to chaos. Well, we're not actually talking about any of those things. In fact, we're not even talking about the Warhammer 40K universe. No, this is very much real world, and I think it's quite interesting where this actually came from, given how defining the Horus Heresy really is to the whole of the 40k universe. So, cast your minds back not to the 30th millennium, but to 1988. Margaret Thatcher is the Prime Minister of the UK, Ronald Reagan is in charge of the US, hair metal is still a thing, and Enya has a #1 with Orinoco Flow. Now at this point, Games Workshop hasn't been around all that long. The company was only founded in 1975, but they've got their game of Warhammer Fantasy Battles, and that's just had its 3rd edition. So we are beginning to get the outline of the games that we know and we love today. In terms of 40k, at this point we've just had the inception of Rogue Trader, the original Warhammer 40k game featuring the Space Marines. And to be honest, it's much more of a role-playing game than a tabletop game. Now, despite setting the broad outlines of the universe, Rogue Trader doesn't contain any reference to the Horus Heresy. No, that's when 1988 comes in, and what appears is Adeptus Titanicus. Now, we know the game today because GW have brought it back, but this is the first version, the original. And when they're making this, they have a bit of a problem. Jervis Johnson, the designer, realises that they only have one mould, one component type for one type of Imperial Titan. So they need to come up with a reason pretty quickly why 2 Imperial Titans, nominally on the same side, would be fighting each other. And so a legend is born. The back of the game talks about a civil war in the Imperium, and we get the first mention of the War Master Horus. Now bear in mind at this point, nothing is really developed. We don't talk about any of the details of the Horus Heresy that we know both through the books and through the lore of the game. So as you can see, this has a really humble origin, and a really mundane one to be honest, because they just had one mould, one type of Titan. And the Horus Heresy is talked about, but it's not really addressed or developed. We don't get any more detail until later in that year with the release of the Realm of Chaos Slaves to Darkness book. Now, if you haven't seen this, and GW did a reprint recently, it's a really key book in the development of the world of 40k, but also the development of Warhammer Fantasy Battles. And indeed, it was more geared towards Fantasy Battles than it was towards 40k, although it did begin to develop the lore of the latter. Now it's interesting that supposedly Rick Priestley, one of the other big luminaries alongside Jervis Johnson of 40k and of Warhammer generally, didn't want Chaos and the Chaos Gods included in 40k at all. He saw them as much more of a fantasy or magic archetype that didn't really have a place in the sci-fi universe of 40k, grimdark and frankly sci-fi fantasy as it was. Despite the objections of some of the key game designers, Brian Ansell, who was pretty much in charge of GW at the time, pushed for the Chaos Gods' inclusion in 40k, or Rogue Trader as it was then. And so, in the Realm of Chaos Slaves to Darkness book, we got our first download on Khorne and Slaanesh, and what exactly they were doing in the world of 40k. Now bear in mind, this is a very big book, and if you haven't seen it before or haven't heard of it, I seriously encourage you to check it out. It's really cool. It has lots of information on chaos and the things that you can do in the early editions of the game, especially in fantasy, with demons and various mutations and things like that you can add onto your characters. So it's just an interesting bit of game history. But what's important for us is it contains the first real details of the Horus Heresy. But it's quite different from what we know today. For example, at this point, Horus is not a Primarch. In fact, Primarchs don't exist at all. Horus is just a general. General Horus was regarded as the finest military commander that the Imperium had produced. His abilities were faultless, and eventually the Emperor granted him the title of Imperial War Master. This was a high honour, even in the early years of the Imperium, when brave deeds were commonplace. Before Horus could travel to Terra to receive his reward, he fell ill on the feral world of Davin. This was his undoing. During his convalescence on Davin, he was inducted into a secret warrior's lodge, which proved to be little more than a coven. A change of character became evident in the War Master. He had been possessed by a demon. Horus's membership of the secret lodge was not unusual. Imperial soldiers were often encouraged to join warrior societies of this type. Recruiting was felt to be easier on worlds where warriors from the stars had become brothers. War Master Horus was recalled to duty in preparation for a new Imperial crusade. It is clear that the War Master introduced the system of warrior lodges into the 5 Legiones Astartes chapters under his direct command. The chapters were entirely corrupted as their lodges revealed their true nature and showed themselves to be nothing less than Chaos Covens. The infection rapidly spread to the orders of Adeptus Mechanicus attached to Horus's command. From there, the rot spread further into the Imperial forces. More than half of the Adeptus Mechanicus, including many units of Collegia Titanica and the Legio Cybernetica, wholeheartedly supported Horus and his vision of a new Imperium of Chaos. This wholesale treachery went undetected by the Inquisition. So there, we have some early details. And again, Horus is not a Primarch, he's just a general. More interestingly, he does get wounded on Davin, but there's none of the additional detail that we have today. He also gets directly possessed by a demon, which, something similar, I guess, does happen in the current iteration of the Horus Heresy, but this is clearly a very early draft. We also have the appearance of the warrior lodges, although again there's not the details of Erebus and Corferon and their spreading of chaos corruption via the warrior lodges throughout the various legions. One other interesting detail at this point is we also get a mention of the Eisenstein and what happens in the Istvan system. Before Horus could move, the Imperial commander of Istvan III declared the entire Istvan system to be an independent principality. The Emperor Administrator, ignorant of the change in Horus, his subordinate chapters and parts of the Adeptus Mechanicus, ordered the War Master to secure the system. Horus chose a bioweapon bombardment on Istvan III, and the planet became a tomb in seconds. The psychic death scream of the 12 billion who died during the scouring of Istvan is reputed to have been louder than the Astronomicon. During the bombardment, loyal Adeptus Astartes officers and troops managed to seize control of the frigate Eisenstein. They had discovered the rot that had been spread through the War Master's chapters in the Adeptus Mechanicus. As Horus completed his withdrawal to Istvan V, the loyalists fled into warp space, carrying a warning for the rest of the Imperium. The seizure of the Eisenstein is regarded as the start of the First Interlegionary War. So there, we have another element. Don't get me wrong, there's no Nathaniel Garrow, which, if you ask me, is a big shame. Oh, and if you don't know who Nathaniel Garrow is, please go and read the Horus Heresy books. He's very cool. He's probably the best Death Guard, and I like the Chaotic guys as well. So we're getting the basic building blocks of the Horus Heresy coming together, and you can see how it's beginning to evolve into what we know and what we have today. Because of Adeptus Titanicus and the ultimate origin of this story, there's quite a lot of focus in the Realm of Chaos book on what's going on with the Titan legions. So as shown in this excerpt here. With the wholesale treachery of the Division Militaris, the loyalist faction within the Collegia Titanica was forced to husband its battlefield resources. Fortunately, many of the weapon shops and supply depots of the Collegia had remained loyal. The priesthood were in control of the Collegia depots, and their presence ensured that these vital resources remained in the hands of the Imperium. The rebels were presented with an immediate supply problem. Damaged and destroyed Titans could not be repaired with the limited spare stockpiles held by individual orders. Savage battles broke out between loyalist and rebel Titan orders. Faced with extinction through lack of spares if they delayed or acted defensively, the rebels attacked. The Collegia histories list many construction adepts who performed their dedication rites on a new Titan, then mounted their charge and took it straight into battle. In some cases, the libations were still wet when it reached combat. Only able to match such fanaticism with their sheer weight of numbers, the rebels were often forced into a position of stalemate. However, despite the valiant defense of these loyal remnants of the Collegia Titanica, enough supplies were captured to allow the rebels to make good use of the Titans during the final assault upon Earth. So as you can see, there is a real focus on what's going on with the Titans, which again makes perfect sense when you think about the fact that the Horus Heresy ultimately is there at this point to really explain what's going on in the Adeptus Titanicus game that's come out in exactly the same year. This passage, though, is really interesting because it does develop further what happened, and one of the really cool details is what happens when Horus's forces get to Earth, and the battle that ensues there, and ultimately Horus's downfall. We do also get an early version of the Istvan V drop site massacre. The passage in Slave to Darkness says thus: "The Emperor took stock of the situation and ordered 7 entire Marine chapters, a third of the Legiones Astartes, to destroy Horus and his rebels. Only with the death of the War Master, the figurehead and inspiration of rebellion, would the revolt come to an end. The crusade against Horus, although of the utmost urgency, took more than 180 days to plan and launch. Horus used the time well, establishing his claim as a new emperor with many of the rebels, and spreading the worship of chaos further afield. The War Master had established a temporary headquarters on Istvan V. The Loyalist chapters struck in quick succession, and the battles of the pacification of Istvan were bloody in the extreme. The first assaults by Loyalist chapters were mauled during their landings, and then destroyed in detail. 3 complete chapters took part in the initial landings on Istvan. Only 5 Marines bearing the gene seed of their departed brothers eventually managed to escape to carry the news of the disaster to the Emperor. Their own Loyalist follow-up waves, rather than attacking the rebels, fell upon their erstwhile allies. Horus had, apparently, managed to corrupt 4 of the 7 chapters sent against him." So there we have an early version of the drop site massacre. No Fulgrim, no Ferrus Manus, no beheading, but still pretty cool. We also get a prototype of the Siege of Terror in this book, which, as we're going through the books now as they're released by Back Library and Games Workshop, is really interesting to read. Slaves to Darkness describes it thus: "The Imperial fleet was bypassed, and its lunar bases destroyed. Within 30 standard days, the War Master had reduced the system defences, invested Earth, and thrown a ring of troops about the Imperial Palace. The forces under Horus' command had ceased to be loyal Imperial Marines. They had become the traitor legions. The Adeptus Custodes, the Imperial Fists and White Scar chapters, and loyalists of the Collegia Titanica were all that remained on Earth. Even their suicidal bravery and the leadership of the Emperor were not enough to prevent the battle turning into a siege. The rebel traitor legions were aided by the machines of the Adeptus Mechanicus, and outnumbered by these, even the bravest loyalists could do little. By the 55th day, the traitor legions and the rebel Adeptus Mechanicus legions had breached the walls of the inner palace. The situation grew more desperate by the hour, and when the outer palace was abandoned to the traitor legions and their allies, the Emperor acted. He disconnected himself from the Astronomicon, a signal to the remainder of the Imperial fleet that the end, one way or another, was approaching. The Emperor and an elite company of Custodes Adeptus soldiery and Imperial Fist Marines were then teleported into Horus's command bunker. In the fierce fighting that followed, Horus was killed, although his body was never found, and the Emperor seriously wounded. With the death of the War Master, the rebels paused in their assaults, then fell back to their transports and fled into space. The Imperial fleet, which had been powerless to intervene while the rebels were within the palace, gave chase. The Emperor returned to the palace, where he was placed within a life bubble. His wounds would be fatal for an ordinary man. Under his watchful eyes, the construction of the Golden Throne, which sustains him to this day, began. So there we are, a very different version from the ending of the Horus Heresy that we know today. No Sanguinius, unfortunately everyone's favourite mighty Hawk Boy, doesn't make his sacrifice because at this point he just doesn't exist. And Horus isn't on the Vengeful Spirit. Horus is on Earth, he's in a command bunker, and the Emperor just teleports in. There's nothing about sort of dropping the shields. He just gets up one day and goes and sorts it out. Another interesting detail here is that at this point the Golden Throne doesn't exist. Now in the story we have today, we know that when the Emperor receives his injuries after fighting Horus, he is interred in the Golden Throne almost immediately, it having been constructed as part of the Webway project. But again, at this point in GW history, none of that exists. The Emperor devises the construction of the Golden Throne whilst, I guess, on life support, and then is strapped into it in a state of semi-death. As for the traitor legions, we do get a similar outcome to what we see in the Scouring, with them eventually fleeing back to the Eye of Terror, which in this book is set out as an area of warp space where the powers of the Chaos Gods have a lot more sway. Interestingly, we also see that there are people on the side of the War Master who clearly didn't really understand chaos or what it was. Slaves to Darkness sets out that those who could flee did so, heading for the Eye of Terror. Many who had declared for the War Master without understanding that demon worship had been the rebellion's cause, they rapidly fell victim to the cultists of the original traitor legions, who, it is said, grew bored of a diet of human flesh. Those destroyed chapters were slowly re-established using what gene seed had been saved. Many systems, including Davin and Istvan, were cleansed and placed under the protection of the Inquisition. The unit designations of the traitor legions were placed on the inactive list and assigned to new Marine chapters raised during later foundings. The first interlegionary war, the Horus Heresy, had lasted less than a decade, but it nearly destroyed the Imperium. So clearly the Horus Heresy is still set out as a pivotal event in the history of the Imperium, but it's really interesting to see how in the 1980s they're just beginning to develop this lore. Now, why am I doing this video? Why do I think this is important? Well, quite frankly, because think about it. This is something that only exists because GW, back in 1988, couldn't make a box set with two different Titans. They had one mould to use, so they needed to come up with a story. This is the very definition of from tiny acorns grow mighty oaks. I mean, this is something where GW just had to deal with a problem about the mould design for the Titanicus game box, and they came up with a story that would go on to define the universe of 40k and the world we all play in today. Now, why do a video on something like this? Well, a couple of reasons. One, I just think it's quite cool. It's interesting to learn about the history of the game and how it's evolved over time. But also because when you're building your army, when you're putting together your narrative, you may come across things, paint errors, maybe you've attached the wrong weapon to something, and you think, wow, I've really screwed that up. But maybe you haven't. Maybe you can come up with a reason for it. Maybe you can come up with your own narrative. And maybe one day that'll blossom into something wonderful for your own army and your own hobby. And that's something that you can use going forward. So I say, take a lesson from GW. If you come across a problem like they did, maybe just come up with a little story to try and explain it within the universe. You never know where it'll lead. So that was a brief look at the secret origin of the Horus Heresy. If you like this video, please like and subscribe below. And if you'd like to hear more about some of the weird and quirky things from the early history of GW, I'd be more than happy to make a video on it. Just drop a comment below this video. But other than that, I've been ADRWargaming. See you next time.